Have you ever got home after photographing a stunning landscape scene, only to be disappointed in how your images turned out? Even that one shot where the conditions were perfect and you were just sure that it was going to be a portfolio level stunner, but something about the composition just feels off. Well, there are 5 bad composition mistakes that can all lead to this devastating feeling of disappointment and regret. But the good news is they're easy to fix. So in this video, I'm going to show you what they are and how each one alone can spoil a great composition, and I'll show you the easy fix for each one so you can begin editing every photo with the same excitement and optimism as you felt when you captured it. To start, let me show you this set of images and see if you can spot the problem that they all suffer with. It's a problem that's most likely to rear its ugly head during stunning sunrise and sunset conditions, but it can crop up wherever there's great light of any kind. Now, these are all from my own shots from back in the day when this mistake used to trip me up more often than I'd like to admit, and it's one of the main reasons my photography just didn't improve as rapidly as I'd have liked back then. And it was because in my early days, I got good at editing way faster than I got good at taking a great photo. In fact, if I'm being brutally honest with you, I probably didn't even realize that at the time. I mean, my editing was at a level where I was able to quit my job and I started making a living from teaching it to others way back in 2013 with my first ever course on luminosity masking. But looking back, taking photos with solid compositions at the time was 50% luck and 50% judgment, maybe even 60-40. And one of the biggest reasons my photos weren't up to scratch was this one big mistake. So take this one for example. I captured it one morning while on a trip around New Zealand at Lake Wanaka. Nice colours in the clouds. I thought, let's crank open the lens and get as much of it in frame as possible. The result? A nothing burger of a composition. It's not even a subject. Now compare that to this one I captured the next morning, taken from the same area, but because the sunlight through the clouds was illuminating these trees, the light actually forced me to zoom in on it. And in a way, it was a happy accident that this composition turned out a lot stronger. And then this third image taken later that day, actually that same night, and I captured a handful of crap compositions first, just focusing on the colourful sky. But something was really bugging me at this point, and I just felt compelled to try and find something, anything to include in the foreground. So I walked up and down the beach a bit, missing potential shots because the light was fading fast. I found this tree, filled the foreground with it on one side of the entire frame, and then fit some of the colourful background in on the left-hand side. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this is the greatest composition in the world, but it's a lot more interesting than this one, right? And so the mistake I was making was prioritizing light and colour over composition. And this one turns out way better because I prioritized composition over the colourful sky. Now, the thing is, when the colours and light are amazing like this in the sky, you don't want to waste a second scurrying around trying to find a solid composition. So you need a way to find them quickly. And fixing, or at least avoiding, each one of these next 4 composition mistakes is going to help you do that. Because do you have any shots like this one floating around your catalogue? I'm not talking about mountains, seascapes, or any other type of scene. I'm talking about shots with a big old foreground that takes up a lot of the frame, most likely taken with a wide angle lens. Now, I'd be surprised if you don't, and that part's not the issue. The issue is what's missing, because typically a wide angle lens emphasizes the foreground, especially when you have the horizon above the center, so the camera is kind of pointing down a bit. It makes things in the foreground feel bigger, and large things, even mountains in the background, feel smaller. Now, if the foreground of your wide angle shot doesn't have something interesting about it, like a texture, a pattern, or an object, ask yourself this: do you really need to include it? Now let me show you how you can test this idea with some of your existing shots so that next time you're out taking new ones, you're better prepared to avoid making this mistake again. So take this image for example. Did I really need to include the foreground? What's it actually bringing to the scene? And what happens if I just crop the whole foreground out and either make it a panoramic aspect or zoom in just on the main subject? It looks a lot better, right? So next time you're at the computer, find 1 or 2 foreground dominant images and see if they look any better with the foreground just completely cropped out. And then let me know your results in the comments. So let me just go back to the original for a second and compare it. And how empty does that foreground feel now that you've seen the cropped version without the foreground? Now the thing is, having an empty foreground like this is just one of the many ways that mistake number 3 can show up in your images, making them feel uninspiring and empty. So let me show you how else this problem can easily pop into your images, ruining them, so that you can just as easily banish it for good. So let's do this with another example from my own back catalogue of poorly composed landscapes. Given what we just talked about, have a guess at what I'm about to say the main problem with this one is. So in the last example, the problem was a big empty foreground. In this one, It's all this empty space over here on the right hand side. Everything that's interesting about this photo is over here on the left hand side of the frame, and this entire half of the photo gives us absolutely no reason to look at it, because it's empty space. Now, there is an important distinction between this empty space with no purpose and the intentional use of negative space. Negative space can be used to create balance, tension, or a minimalist appearance, so that's not what I'm talking about here. The kind of space I want you to eliminate from your compositions is empty space that makes the photo feel unbalanced and serves no purpose. So in other words, if everything that you want the viewer to look at is over on one side of the frame, do you really need to include the other side? And then once you answer that, the question becomes, what do you do about it? Well, these three options will have you covered for the majority of the time. 1, you can zoom in on just those elements that are important to the composition. 2, you can turn the camera upways and shoot a vertical composition. Or 3, you can just acknowledge what's happening and plan to crop something like a square composition later in editing. In the case of this example image on screen, the best option would have been to turn the camera and shoot it vertically, because that would also eliminate another mistake present in the original photo, which brings me on to mistake number 4, which is a very sneaky one that can go unnoticed a lot of the time, because it's quite subtle. Now, you might have heard before about what happens when you have distracting elements near the edges of your frame. Bright or high contrast objects that draw your eye away from the main elements and out towards the edge of the frame are going to break the visual flow of the scene and lead you out of the image. So it's solid advice to look out for those and eliminate them from your compositions where possible, and where not possible, just clone the small ones out in Photoshop. But there is a more subtle kind of distraction that takes away from the main subject, which is just the general brightness of this entire half of the frame, caused by the sunlight and its reflection on the water. Now, the reason I say it's subtle is because it's not a physical thing, it's just light. And in this image, it totally distracts from the main subject, making it a battle to even drag your eye away from it because it's so bright. And that sucks, because even though that's where we're forced to look, there's nothing interesting to look at. So like I said a second ago, to fix this entire composition, I could have and should have shot a vertical composition, concentrating only on the main subject and the background. Now, mistake number 5 is kind of like the opposite of mistake number 4, but it can be just as devastating to your compositions, because the only thing that's worse than a composition that forces you to look at a big empty space full of nothing is one like this, where there's so many different things going on that you're getting dragged all over the frame with no visual flow to speak of. But the good news is that there's a technique you can use in the field to simplify busy scenes, to find a balanced, dynamic composition. And when you use this one technique, it actually becomes even easier to avoid all 5 of these mistakes that I've shown you in this video in one fell swoop. Watch this video next to find out what it is and how to use it to take your compositions to the next level.